Years since thousands of South Africans gathered in Kliptown in Soweto to adopt one of the most defining documents of the country's struggle for freedom, the Freedom Charter. Drafted in 1955 by the Congress of the People and with input from communities across the country, the Charter boldly declared the people shall govern. Well, it went on to demand equal rights, land redistribution, an issue that still plagues the country to this day, access to education and healthcare, and an end to racial discrimination, principles that would later find echoes in South Africa's democratic constitution. Now, as we reflect on this milestone, we're now joined by Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, SC, who's a constitutional lawyer, a legal scholar and author, and also a key voice on issues of justice, land reform, and democratic rights. And he'll help us unpack the enduring significance of the Freedom Charter and what it actually means in South Africa and to South Africans today. Advocate Ngcukaitobi, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. I'm so pleased to have been invited.
So let's go back to 1955. And I wonder, when we look at what the Freedom Charter said and represented, how do you think it redefined the concept of a democracy, especially for those who'd never experienced it before?
And I suppose we could firstly conceive of it during the time of its adoption. So we just go back to 1953. That's 2 years before Kliptown. What was this country like then? So that's 5 years after the Nationalist Party has assumed power. And the National Party's policy is clear that it will create a racial oligarchy in which Afrikanerdom will be the central tenet of government. And it's explicit, by the way, of the policy of apartheid, which is the racial domination of blacks by whites. But at the same time, you have grassroots resistance to the racial oligarchy. So what we then had was an inevitable conflict that on the grassroots, people were establishing their own democracies because there was an illegitimate sort of racially driven administration. And so how did it define the concept of democracy? What it did is that it meant that democracy would begin from below up, right? It would begin from below up. But at the same time, the democracy that they were contesting at the time would happen against the sacrifice of life. So that's 1953. That's at the time at which the concept of the Congress of the People is conceived by Professor Z.K. Matthews. In 1955, what he does is something remarkable, because at the time the politics were racialized. Even the ANC was an exclusively Africanist party. But between 1953 and 1955, something truly remarkable and revolutionary happens. They are able to extend the ideas of the Charter to the Indian National Congress, to the Congress of Democrats, and to colored organizations, which then makes the conference in 1955 a defining one, because it becomes the truly non-racial conference. And that sends a very devastating message to the National Party, because it challenges at root the concept of apartheid. And so it's in fact the beginning of the end of apartheid.
Right. So one area that you've spent a lot of time in research and come up with 2 books is land. And I'm curious about when the Freedom Charter says the land shall be shared among those who work it. How should we read that? Does that mean if you don't use the land, you shouldn't get any of it? Or what? How do you interpret that? Help us in a modern context in particular.
Yes. So, I mean, if we just go back to the actual clause itself, and look at it in full. So that clause is interesting because it's the clause that comes after the wealth clause. So if you look at the order of those clauses, the clause that comes immediately before that is the clause that says the people shall share in the country's wealth, right? And then what it says is that the national wealth of the country is the heritage of South Africans, and it will be restored to all of the people, right? And then immediately thereafter is then the land clause. And there are two important things that clause refers to. The one is that it will abolish the restrictions on land ownership, right? And then the land will then be redivided among those who work it. And why? In order to banish famine and land hunger. So then what it is then doing, so that's the first part, right? And then the second part is the role of the state, where it says that the state must help the peasants with implements, seed, tractors, dams, to save the soil and to assist the tillers. So two things are critical about that. The one is that you are going to abolish the racial restriction. Those racial restrictions come from 1913, in which Africans were prohibited from owning land. So abolish that in order to enable anyone and everyone to have access to the land. Once you have done that, you have to redivide the land among those who work it. But why? In order to banish famine and land hunger. In other words, the goal is to end land injustice. So that goal is in fact reflected in Section 25 of the Constitution. Now, there are people who tend to interpret that in a very narrow way to say, if you don't work the land, therefore you are not entitled to the land. No. The clause that comes immediately before that is to end the restrictions of land ownership that are based on race. And then after that, it then refers to the intention of ending land hunger. And so those are the two goals that are then consolidated in Section 25, which says, firstly, you have to do a restitution process. Secondly, you have to do a redistribution process. Why? Because we're trying to end land injustice. And then, crucially, is then the big subclause, which is the state must assist the peasants. Now, we have a crisis today in South Africa where even people who have received land, right, are not able to work the land because there is no state assistance, which itself is a betrayal of the Charter, because the Charter specifically requires the state to assist people that are recipients of land reform. So how would I interpret it today? I've argued, probably as you say in your introduction, that the priority for land reform must be farm workers. But what we have today is that the priority for land reform are the elites that are associated with the ANC. Now that is a betrayal of the Charter.
Okay, so you've written two interesting books on this issue. The first one, The Land is Ours, you trace the legacy of black legal resistance to land dispossession. And then in Land Matters, you spend a lot of time looking at the state's approach to land distribution as bureaucratic, market-driven, and you've just said as well that it really is about benefiting a few people. What would it take, do you think, for South Africa to move from something that you might describe as policy inertia to actual redistribution? Because in the end, the land story, I think, tells the story of inequality in the best possible way.
Yes. Peter, thank you. I mean, that's still a crucial question. There are basic things that can be done right now, today. Do you know that South Africa still, in 2025, today, still the official policy on land acquisition is still willing seller, willing buyer? That's still the approach that they adopt to every acquisition of land. It's still willing seller, willing buyer, right? The state has not come out explicitly to abolish willing seller, willing buyer, even though willing seller, willing buyer was a mistake in 1995. And it was a mistake in conflict. I mean, in 1997, it was a mistake in conflict with the constitution that had been adopted in 1996, which anchored the policy on equity and justice. So first thing, we need a clear policy statement that willing seller, willing buyer is not state policy. And it must filter down to every organ of state that acquires land for land reform purposes, that willing seller, willing buyer is not part of the law. Secondly, you know that the state has still not resolved land claims from 1998. There are 5,700 of them. Since 1998, we are approaching 30 years of land claims, have still not been resolved. And it's the bureaucratic inefficiency and corruption. You know that the Special Investigative Unit investigated land reform. They found that in every 4 land claims, one of them is corrupt. I mean, imagine this is astonishing. 25% of all land claims are corrupt.
Wow.
It's truly, truly, truly mind-boggling. Then, so you have to resolve those, and you have to address the problem of corruption that is bedeviling the land reform process. Then, thirdly, the problem was a policy problem from the beginning. The ANC in the Reconstruction and Development Program adopted in September 1994, you know what they wanted to do with land reform? They wanted primarily a redistributive model. That's what they wanted. But they abandoned a redistributive model, right, as soon as they became the government. And why? My research in land matters shows that it was the World Bank that imposed a market-driven land reform process. Right. So for as long as we have constrained the ability of the Constitution to give effect to transformation by market fundamentalism, we are going nowhere. So these are the 3 changes. They are all within the power of the government. But those changes are constrained internally by ANC policy, which stubbornly still follows a market fundamentalist approach. So we have to free ourselves from the dogma of the market in order to achieve true redistribution, going back to the fundamentals of the Freedom Charter, the RDP, and the Ready to Govern document.
We're going to move away from land just now, but I am curious about one other thing, especially when you think about issues like the Ingonyama Trust in KwaZulu-Natal. What role do traditional leadership structures and communal land tenure systems play in either advancing or even blocking progress, in your view?
No, they are a stumbling block to land reform, Peter. They are a stumbling block to land reform. We have to call this out because the Constitution requires the land to be distributed to the people. It requires a tenure system to be reformed in order to enable you and I to access, to own, to use, or to settle on the land. But the traditional institutions, right, want a different regime in which the land is owned and controlled by the chiefs. So when you have the Freedom Charter saying the land shall be shared among those who work it, the chiefs actually want the control of that land. And unfortunately, most policy interventions in the form of legislation that have come with the ANC have tended to side with the chiefs at the expense of the people. But Ingonyama Trust is also a prime example of this problem, in which sometimes the chiefs impose taxes and rentals on the people in order to reside on the land. So that land tenure system in which the chiefs dominate the control over the land itself is unconstitutional and requires fundamental reforms.
So let's go more broadly now about the Freedom Charter. Just before our conversation began, we heard a report, and in there we heard from a well-known analyst, consultant, Walter Tembeka, who said that the Freedom Charter, by and large, everything that was in there has been fulfilled. And a lot of people will say, no way. What are your thoughts about the Freedom Charter, the promises that it had, and the lived reality of today?
Peter, you don't have to listen to me. You can yourself look at the reports of the World Bank the report of the World Bank in 2018 and the report of the World Bank in 2021. They did the first thoroughgoing study on wealth distribution in South Africa by reference to race and gender and geography. They repeated that study in 2021, again using race, gender, geography. What they found is that on the Gini coefficient, and the Gini coefficient is basically a model that looks at the highest, but it uses income to look at the highest paid versus the lowest paid. They found on that we were the most unequal in the world. And the same statistics came out through in 2021. What they also found was that people living in rural areas are poorer than people living in the townships and in the suburbs. They also found that poverty has a face, and that face is a black female, an African female in particular. They also found that people were now poorer than they were in 1994. Can you imagine that statistics? Poorer than you were in 1994. So which means what we have done is what Sample Blanche called the creation of an underclass. Right? And then they found that the rich people in this country are super rich, like super rich. They are equivalent to the wealthy of Europe, equivalent to the wealthy of Asia. And then they found that the wealth doesn't trickle down. The wealth calcifies at the top. Now, you tell me, Peter, on your own, the Freedom Charter promises the end to wealth inequality. How on earth can anyone argue that the goals of the Freedom Charter have been achieved in a climate in which we have the dubious honor of being the most unequal country in the world? Now, of course, there are basic rights that are contained in the Constitution, which the Freedom Charter intended. And of course, the laws that prescribe racial discrimination have been abolished. But recently, a book by Edwin Cameron on the prison system shows one astonishing statistics, that the majority of criminal accused in our lower courts who have no access to legal representation are African men. And this is why they stay in prison even though they've been granted bail, because they are unable to pay. So even though in form we have access to the court system, access to legal representation, the overwhelming majority of criminal accused do not have access to legal representation because the systems of legal representations are inadequate. So let's not kid ourselves. I mean, from beginning to end, the Charter has been betrayed.
All right, as we wrap up, because we're running out of time, and 70 years ago is a long time. The country is mostly young people. They probably study it in school, in history, and so it may not hold the same emotion as older South Africans for them. I'm curious, what might a modernized version of the Freedom Charter look like today, especially if it was written by today's youth?
Peter, I marvel at the Charter. I mean, if you look at the opening words, I mean, it still today gives me goosebumps, as if it was the time, I think I first read the Charter when I was probably 14 or 15. And at the time, the Charter was still banned, in the country. Now, but at the time, it gave me goosebumps. It still does so now, and I'm in my 40s now, right? The words that open the Charter, we the people of South Africa, I mean, those words are irreplaceable. They are the opening words of South Africa. And if you look at what it says thereafter, declare for all in our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. I mean, those are irreplaceable. They are immortal words, So, and even today's struggles of young people are still anchored on this idea of belonging. And it's belonging about those who live in it. So even if you're dealing with the problems of migrants, of economic migrants from Zimbabwe, it's still around these words. So I think that the Charter is one of those special documents, almost like the Magna Carta of 1215 in England, or almost like the Independence Constitution of the United States, So there are certain words in certain documents that are just timeless. I think the Charter is one of those. And so I think that it's very difficult to conceive of what else we could have said in the Charter that has not been said in the Charter.
Advocate Ngcukaitobi, unfortunately we've run out of time, but thank you so much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us on such an important issue. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
That's Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, SC, Senior Counsel, a constitutional lawyer, legal scholar and author, talking to us about the Freedom Charter as it's been commemorated in South Africa 70 years later. Right now, it's time for your news headlines. Here's Jwalani Tulongwepe.